You have done a remarkable job with your work, but you've really touched on something this time, Greg, and it's a great night to talk with you about it coming out of the holidays with the science of miracles. And you've looked at it with a different perspective, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your reason for going into this, first of all.
Well, the reason that I'm going into all that we're doing, first of all, I think that you and our listeners probably know that by the time a book makes it to the shelves of a bookstore or a DVD is produced, that the information that was in that book or in that DVD is just the tip of the iceberg of a much broader body of information underlying all of that. And as authors, we have to choose what it is that and how we share that to bring our work to a greater visibility. What we know is that we're facing a time in the history of our country, in the history of our world. Many people sense that something very different is happening now, and the experts are now telling us that that is precisely the case, George. They're saying that this is an unprecedented time in the history of our planet, of our civilization. And the experts were called together for an amazing conference in the year 2005. And the results of this conference were so profound that they were actually published as a special edition of the journal Scientific American. It was titled Crossroads for Planet Earth in 2005. And the bottom line is that the experts, the scientists, the engineers, the social architects, the religious leaders, so many different disciplines, they all came together and they identified a number of scenarios ranging from disease and competition for resources to energy production and war. And what they said was that any of these scenarios alone have the power to forever change or possibly end civilization in the world as we know it. Any one of them alone. And what makes our time, this moment in history, so powerful and so profound is that all of these events are happening at the same time. And they said, we've got the next 8, maybe 10, 15 years to figure this out, or nothing else is really going to make much difference. The Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson identified our time in history, and I love the term. He says we're entering what he calls a bottleneck in time.
That is a good term.
He says it's a time when our resources and our ability to solve the problems of our day are going to be pushed to their limits. Well, I can't believe that anybody doesn't feel that that's precisely what's happening right now. So that is the context within which we're looking at the science. Some of the science, George, is so new it hasn't made it into the textbooks yet, and many of the discoveries are validating some of our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions, the very traditions that were lost and edited from Western culture 1,700 years ago, but they've been preserved in some of the most pristine monasteries in some of the most remote parts of the world. And when we factor these discoveries into our time in history, George, it changes everything. So the reason I'm excited, and you can tell I'm excited about tonight, is because what we're going to talk about over these next couple of hours is so fundamental that there is nothing that any guest could bring to this program that is not somehow impacted by the discussion we're going to have tonight. Everything from the elections of the nations, the peace between nations, to the healing of our bodies. And it all comes back to our relationship to our world and the universe and things that we're only beginning to understand.
Has science stumbled into this where, let's say, people who are experts in metaphysics knew this for years?
Well, I think what has happened is, first of all, I'm just going to preface this. I was trained in the hard sciences. I come from the world of science. I support the scientific method. And I'm not down on science, George. I think science has done some wonderful things.
No doubt.
For where we are in the world today, and it's allowed us to do things that were miracles in my grandfather's time. Before he died, he and I had a conversation where he told me that the new discoveries were happening so fast he just couldn't keep up with them. They were so amazing in his mind, he couldn't find a way to make sense of them. And it was all based in science. And as good as science is, What we're going to talk about tonight, George, is a couple of assumptions that were made over 100 years ago. And science is only about 300 years old in terms of the scientific method.
Right.
So we accept science as beginning around the time of when Newton formalized the laws of physics. That's when we say science actually began. Well, about 100 years ago, a series of experiments were conducted to settle the argument as to whether or not there's a field of energy that connects everything and whether or not we're connected with that field. The results of those experiments, in my opinion, were poorly interpreted, and they have set us on a false course, false assumptions in science that have led us into a series of dead ends and up against the brick wall in trying to explain the universe and the way we work within the universe. So the first false assumption, I'll say it right now, the first false assumption is that the space between things is empty. We now know that's absolutely not true. And the second false assumption is that our inner experiences, what we call thought, feeling, emotion, and belief, have no effect on the world beyond our bodies. And I'll tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. And this is what the new discoveries are showing us, and this is what changes everything.
Why is it important for us to grasp the fact that there may be things between spaces?
If in the assumption, first of all, we'll go back. The experiments that were conducted in the late 1800s, the very famous Michelson-Morley experiment, was conducted in 1887 publicly. What a lot of people don't know is that it had already been conducted in 1881 privately. And both times, the scientists came up with the same results. And the results suggested that everything is separate from everything else. If there's nothing filling the empty space, in lay terms, it suggests that everything is separate from everything else. And for that reason, what happens in point A has no effect on what happens in point B. If it looks like it does, it's only a coincidence. And we have an entire civilization now built upon the belief that what we do in one place doesn't have an effect or doesn't make any difference on something that's happening somewhere else. And that false assumption has written us, humankind, right out of the equations of the universe and how things work, and it's been the stumbling block for what we're calling this unified field theory that is yet to come together. There's some promising foundations out there like string theory, superstring theory, that have been around since the 80s, but we've got to ask if these theories are the right path, if they're putting us on the right path, and they've been around for 20-plus years with the best minds of our time working on them and the best computing power we've ever had. Why are they still theories? Why? To unify the forces of nature and provide a single story that explains the way the universe works and our role in the universe. And this is where everything's changing, George. This is why it's so exciting to be able to share this information tonight.
Could this also be the fact that there is this wireless internet out there in the universe or the multiverse that seems to connect everything?
I think that's precisely what I think is happening, George. It's so interesting. We talk about the great challenges of our time in history on the one hand. On the other hand, the inability of science to solve some of our problems. I tend to look at the big picture, and what I see happening is the very conditions that we've created, that science has created in our world, the conditions of disease and energy consumption, the possibility and the threat of global war. Those very conditions are now driving us to understand who we are to survive the conditions that we've created. And I think what is so incredible about this time in history is this is when we get to find out what's real and what's not, what works and what doesn't. You know, we've heard from the mid-1980s and the harmonic convergence that we're all one, we're part of our world, and that we have powers beyond our most amazing dreams, and people would like to believe that.
You know, Greg, we might not have enough time to figure that. We won't have the time to make the mistake to figure it out. I think the clock is really ticked beyond where we should be.
Well, I agree with you, George, that the clock is ticking very quickly. I'm going to share tonight there is a global project that has just come online early in this year, the 2008. that I'm going to be able to talk about tonight that allows every one of our listeners to participate in not just watch, not just observe, and not just guess as to whether or not they're having an effect, but to know that they're literally having an effect upon the fields of the earth, upon fields that are called coherent fields of the earth that affect everything from the peace between nations to the health of our bodies to our sleep patterns to our relationships. I'm very excited to be sharing this information tonight. So we're going to cover a lot of ground over these next couple of hours.
And is it our ability to tap into this that changes these things for the better for us?
Well, yes. The fact is that we all already tap into it. The key is to do so consistently, predictably, and in a way that allows us to create the conditions in our lives that we're choosing to help us to become better people and have a better world. That's the bottom line to this ancient traditions that I'll be talking about that we found practiced in the monasteries in the mountains of Egypt and the highlands of central China and Tibet. And now our own science is bearing out the very principles that have been preserved in these ancient wisdom traditions in non-scientific ways. So we walk into a monastery in the highlands of central China, and the monks aren't talking about quantum fields and holographic, experiences. What they do is they giggle because to them this is so basic. They giggle and they say, this is the way you work and this is the way your world works. And when we marry the wisdom that's been preserved in some of these remote and pristine, magnificent temples and monasteries and in some of the hardest to get to parts of the world, we marry what's been preserved there with the best science of our time is now telling us. What I believe we're finding, we're building for ourselves a spiritually based science that for some people sounds like an oxymoron, but I believe that this spiritually based science will meet the challenges that we're talking about tonight. And George, while I agree the clock is ticking, what we're finding is that the changes happen so quickly. I think we've got all the time we need, and now is the time to make the choices.